Chapter 1. The New Meat. The air in the processing plant was syrupy with humidity and the coppery tang of blood. Overhead, fluorescent lights buzzed faintly, washing everything in a bruised, sickly glow. The floors, scrubbed so many times they seemed polished, still harbored faint stains, ghost prints of past work that the industrial cleaning solvents couldn't entirely erase. Marcos moved down the inspection line with the slow, methodical cadence of someone half asleep or half dead. His gloved hands pressed into slabs of slick, pale flesh, checking for consistency, elasticity, compliance. He pressed harder than necessary sometimes, feeling the slight give of muscle beneath his fingers, the faint heat that hadn't yet been leached out by refrigeration. He told himself it was no different than it had been when he worked in animal slaughterhouses. Flesh was flesh. Meat was meat. The government said so, the companies said so, and eventually even the advertisements said so, bright and cheery with their slogans. Pure, ethical, essential. And yet the nausea never left. It was a quiet thing, a low-rolling sickness that he kept buried under layers of ritual and habit. It stirred sometimes when he saw a tuft of hair not fully shaved or a faint crescent of fingernail left behind, and he would force it back down with a breath, with a swallow, with a blink. His mind had long since learned to glaze over the details. He saw shapes, weights, textures, colors, not bodies. Still, the part of him that still dreamed, the part that still recoiled without permission, made itself known in small ways. His hands would tremble slightly as he filled out the inspection forms. His teeth would clench so tightly by the end of his shift that he sometimes found blood when he spit into the sink at home. Tonight, the line was moving slower than usual. A shipment had arrived late. Not the pre-packaged product they usually received, but raw, intact units, straight from the breeding farms. There was an understanding, unspoken but ironclad, that inspectors were to be especially thorough with these. Premium clients demanded assurances of purity and health. Marcos bent over a new crate. He could smell the difference immediately, a warmer, sweeter odor, like burnt sugar and iron. The flesh was less processed, the blood still wet enough to bead at the edges. He jabbed the identification scanner at the crate's code sticker without looking, waiting for the customary chime of confirmation. Instead, the scanner emitted a dull, reluctant beep, an error tone. Frowning, Marcos looked directly at the label for the first time that night. The crate didn't have the usual alphanumeric code. It had a name. Isabel Contreras. The letters were handwritten in black marker, the ink bleeding slightly into the corrugated surface. There was something hurried about the script, a desperate slant to it, as if whoever had written it hadn't meant to linger. Marco stood there for a moment, longer than he should have, the scanner loose in his hand. His throat felt tight, like someone had reached inside and was squeezing. He glanced around instinctively, but the processing floor was empty except for him. The others had already clocked out. The humming machines and the rows of dangling product didn't care what he saw or didn't see. No witnesses. No need to say anything. He placed the scanner back onto its charging station with exaggerated care. His gloves made faint, squeaking noises against the plastic. He filled out the intake form manually, skipping the fields that would have required more explanation. No one double-checked at this hour. As he turned to leave, his gaze snagged, just for a second, on the edge of the crate. Was it his imagination, or had the corner shifted? Just a fraction, a soft thud from inside, so soft he might have mistaken it for the settling of cooling meat. Marcos tightened his grip on his clipboard until his knuckles whitened. It was nothing. The old habits came to his rescue, smothering the swell of panic with routine. He marched to the locker room, peeled off his gloves and apron with jerky, efficient movements. His reflection in the mirror above the sink looked drained, waxy, the skin around his eyes bruised with fatigue. He didn't recognize himself anymore, but that was neither new nor important. He scrubbed his hands until they were raw, even though the gloves should have made it unnecessary. He told himself it was because of the smell, the way it clung, stubborn and accusing, no matter how much soap he used. By the time he exited through the loading dock doors, the night air was thick and cloying, carrying the sweet, sick smell of the plant with it. The sodium lights in the parking lot cast harsh pools of orange, making the darkness between them feel heavier, more impenetrable. His car sat alone at the far end of the lot, the black paint blending almost seamlessly into the night. Marcos adjusted the strap of his duffel bag over his shoulder and started walking, each step ringing out sharply in the silence. Halfway there, something made him stop. A sound, faint, almost imperceptible, like the dragging of something heavy across the concrete. He turned his head slowly, heart slamming against his ribs. The loading dock behind him was dark, the overhead light flickering intermittently. The big steel doors were still closed. No movement. He told himself it was an animal, a stray dog, a rat maybe. They came sometimes, drawn by the scent. They were harmless. He kept walking, faster now. As he reached the driver's side door, fumbling with his keys, he heard it again, closer this time. Drag, scrape, whisper. He whipped around, scanning the darkness. Nothing. Only the endless, rustling silence of the plant behind him, the empty lot stretching away in all directions. Still, he couldn't shake the sensation, stronger now, that he was being watched, that something was out here with him, patient and deliberate. His fingers finally found the keyhole. He yanked the door open, slid inside, and slammed it shut with a force that rattled the windows. His breathing was ragged, too loud inside the small space. He forced himself to start the engine, the familiar rumble grounding him slightly. Headlights carved twin tunnels of visibility into the night. For a moment he hesitated, gripping the steering wheel so hard it hurt. He could go back. He could report it. The crate with the name. It wasn't right. Someone needed to know. But then what? Another inspection, another report buried under paperwork, another day pretending that what he saw, what he knew, wasn't real. He backed out of the space, tires crunching over loose gravel. In the rearview mirror, just before he turned onto the main road, he thought he saw something at the edge of the lot. A figure, crouched low to the ground, its limbs too long, too thin, watching him leave. By the time he looked back, it was gone. Chapter 2. Compliance Training. The conference room smelled of stale coffee, disinfectant, and something harder to name. The faint, metallic aftertaste of fear. Fluorescent panels above buzzed inconsistently, some flickering with a mechanical urgency that no one acknowledged. Rows of workers sat shoulder to shoulder at the long tables, their faces slack, turned toward the screen at the front where a woman in a navy blazer clicked through a series of slides. Marcos sat among them, hands folded in, his lap a slight tremor running through his right knee that he couldn't quite still. He focused on the sharp, dry click of the presenter's remote, the way her perfectly manicured finger pressed and released over and over. On the screen, a bright, smiling figure held a neatly packaged tray of flesh, gloved hands offering it forward like a gift. The language of success, the slide proclaimed in cheerful font. Remember, the woman said, her voice lilting with artificial warmth. Language creates reality. Words matter. Consumers, not victims. Product, not people. Let's practice together. A murmur passed through the room as the workers repeated the words, voices flat, mechanical. Marcos mouthed them without sound. His tongue felt thick, his throat dry. He knew the words. He had used them. They slid easily enough across his paperwork, his inspections, his daily reports. But now, when he tried to summon them, they sat leaden and alien on his tongue, refusing to be shaped. In his mind's eye, the crate reappeared, the slanted black handwriting, the soft, almost imperceptible shifting of the corner. Isabel Contreras. A name, not a number. A person, not a product. The presenter clicked to the next slide. Misuse of terminology equals contamination. There was a thin, brittle silence in the room. Marcos felt it settle over him like a shroud. The woman smiled again, too wide, too many teeth. Contamination doesn't only come from the outside, it can start here. She tapped two, fingers lightly against her temple. Thoughts lead to words, words lead to actions, actions lead to accidents. She paused, letting the last word hang, heavy and accusatory. On the screen, a photo appeared. A stainless steel processing floor slick with blood, a broken crate overturned, something blurred and unspeakable sprawled half out of it. Marcos looked away. The woman went on, voice smooth as glass. Stay vigilant, stay pure, stay successful. Another click, another smiling slide, another set of rote phrases to memorize. Around him, the other workers scribbled notes, nodded attentively. Marcos stared down at his blank notebook, the pen lying useless across the page. His hand twitched, and without thinking, he scrawled the name in the margin. Isabel Contreras. He snapped the notebook shut before anyone could see. The evening passed in a blur, tasks completed without memory. His body moved automatically through the routines, shower, dinner, dishes, but everything felt distant, as though he were watching himself from somewhere far away, behind a thick pane of glass. By the time Marcos climbed into bed, exhaustion pulled at him like heavy chains. Still, sleep did not come easily. He lay there, staring at the hairline cracks in the ceiling, listening to the faint creaks and groans of the building settling into the night. The hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, the tick, tick, tick of the wall clock, and beneath it all, a softer sound. Breathing. At first, he thought it was his own, a shallow, uneven rhythm, but the cadence was wrong. Staggered, desperate, muffled. Marco squeezed his eyes shut. It's nothing, he told himself. The mind plays tricks. It echoes. It invents. The breathing continued, steady and ragged. He shifted under the covers, muscles tense. He told himself he wouldn't look, that there was nothing there. The air felt too warm, pressing down on him like a hand. Sweat beaded along his hairline. Finally, with a resigned shudder, he opened his eyes. The room was unchanged, the faint glow of the streetlights leaking through the blinds, the cracked ceiling, the battered dresser across from the bed. But at the foot of the bed, something sat, a figure. Its shape was wrong. Lumpy, shrouded in something translucent and crinkling. Plastic wrap. A sheet of it drawn tight over skin and bone, the outlines of ribs and hips barely visible beneath. It shifted slightly and the plastic crackled. The breathing grew louder. Marcos tried to move, but his body felt paralyzed, pinned by the weight of terror. The figure tilted its head. Its face was obscured by the clouded plastic, but he imagined, he could see the gleam of eyes behind it. Wide and pleading. It raised one arm, slow and trembling, and pointed toward him, toward the name he had written, still burned into the back of his eyelids even now. Isabel Contreras. The sound of the breathing grew sharper, hitching into a sob. Marcos opened his mouth to speak, to scream, to do anything, but no sound came out. The figure began to crawl toward him, dragging itself across the bed, the plastic rasping against the sheets with a noise like dry leaves. Marcos jerked upright, heart hammering. The bed was empty. The room was still. The clock read 3:06 a.m. He pressed his hands to his face, breathing hard, trying to will the dream. Because it had to be a dream. From his mind. His palms were slick with sweat, trembling uncontrollably. He swung his legs over the side of the bed, sat there for a long moment, head in his hands. When he finally stood, he moved mechanically, almost without thought, padding toward the kitchen for a glass of water. The hallway was dark, the floorboards cold under his bare feet. As he passed the front door, he froze. There, neatly placed on the welcome mat, was a package, wrapped in translucent plastic, a faint outline visible through the film. A hand, small and pale, the fingers curled into a loose, unnatural fist. Pinned to the plastic was a slip of paper. One word written in hurried, slanted handwriting. Return. Chapter 3. The Gift. The office smelled faintly of whiskey, sweat, and something sweeter, like spoiled milk. The leather chair behind the heavy desk groaned under the weight of Mr. Casals as he leaned forward, the overhead light casting harsh shadows under his chin. Marcos stood stiffly on the other side of the desk, the thick carpet swallowing the sound of his shifting feet. His hands remained neatly folded behind his back, though the knuckles had gone pale. Mr. Casales smiled, a slow, indulgent smile that showed yellowing teeth. "You've been loyal," he said, voice syrupy, slipping around the edges of civility like oil. "And loyalty deserves recognition." He gestured lazily toward the far side of the room. Marcos turned his head. In the corner, half shrouded in shadow, was a figure, swaddled in thick, clear plastic, bound tightly around the body like a second skin. Pale limbs were curled, inward, fetal. A thin tube protruded from the nose, taped down sloppily against clammy skin. The plastic crinkled slightly with every shallow rise and fall of the chest. Alive, then. Barely. Pure stock, Casales said, like he was offering a bottle of wine. No mutations, no cross-contamination, untouched. Yours. Marcos said nothing. His stomach churned, low and heavy. He knew better than to refuse, better to nod, to smile, to accept. The wrong kind of hesitation could be noticed, could be remembered. He nodded. Casales clapped him once on the shoulder, hard enough to stagger him slightly. "Good man, take her. Treat her as you see fit." The words buzzed in Marcos's ears as he bent, gripped the figure under the arms. The plastic was slick against his gloves, and the body was limp, heavier than it looked. As he lifted, he caught a glimpse of her face through the film, mouth slightly open, eyelids fluttering, a thin string of drool escaping one corner of her lips. She made a small sound then, not quite a word, not quite a whimper, and Marcos pretended not to hear it. He carried her to his car in the darkness, a pale bundle cradled against his chest like an oversized child. The night air was sharp, but the figure radiated a damp, feverish heat even through the wrapping. He drove with the windows down, the chill searing his face, trying to purge the lingering smell from his nostrils. The streets were nearly empty at this hour. Pools of light from street lamps gave way to long stretches of impenetrable darkness, the car's headlights slicing through like a blade. At stoplights, he didn't look at the bundle in the passenger seat. He didn't want to see if it moved. At home, Marcos placed her, in the farthest corner of the living room, beside a broken floor lamp he kept meaning to fix. The apartment was small and grimy in the way that no amount of cleaning could fix. Shadows clung to the edges of the rooms, thick and stubborn. The air was stale, tinged with the faint, sour reek of mold. He fetched an old quilt from the closet and draped it over her, more for his own sanity than for warmth. The lumpy, plastic-wrapped figure looked less human that way, more like an abandoned piece of furniture, a forgotten thing. He left the lights off when he went to bed. The silence was immense, a living thing pressing against his ears. He lay flat on his back, eyes open in the dark, listening to the uneven rhythm of his own breathing. At first he thought the sound was in his head, a phantom noise conjured by guilt and exhaustion, a faint, wet sobbing, barely audible the way a leaking faucet might whisper in an otherwise silent house. It came and went, rhythmic and ragged, like someone trying, failing to cry quietly. The pipes, he told himself, the plumbing in this place was ancient. It groaned and moaned at all hours. He had heard it before. But the sobs continued, threading through the darkness with a terrible persistence. He squeezed his eyes shut, pulled the thin blanket up to his chin. He didn't have to check. He didn't have to move. If he stayed still, if he didn't acknowledge it, maybe it would stop. Maybe it would prove itself imaginary. The sobs grew softer, softer. Then silence. The quiet returned so suddenly that it felt wrong, unnatural, like the instant when a record skips and the music vanishes mid-note. For a long time, Marcos lay there, muscles rigid, waiting for something else to happen. It didn't. Eventually, against his better judgment, he slept. The dream began with plastic, sheets and sheets of it, billowing around him in endless waves, wrapping around his limbs, clinging to his skin. He struggled, but the more he moved, the tighter it bound him, cutting into his wrists, his ankles, his throat. Somewhere in the suffocating tangle, he could hear breathing, not his own, labored, wet, close enough to fog the plastic around his face. Hands, small and desperate, grasped at him from the folds, pulling him down, down into the smothering dark. He tried to scream, but the plastic filled his mouth, his lungs. A single word floated through the murk, thin and trembling. "Please." Marcos woke with a jolt, heart hammering, throat raw. The room was dark, but the shape in the corner was visible even without light. A deeper shadow within the shadow. Still there. Still motionless. Except he leaned forward slightly, straining his eyes. Had the quilt shifted? Had the figure moved? A trick of the light, he told himself. A trick of the dream lingering on the edges of his mind. He turned his face to the wall, pulling the covers tighter around himself. He did not see the way the figure under the quilt stirred, almost imperceptibly. Did not hear the faint, wet rustle of plastic tightening and relaxing like lungs struggling to inflate. Did not notice the faint imprint of a hand pressing outward from beneath the fabric. Fingers, splayed, reaching. Chapter 4. Domestication. The first morning after the dream, Marco stood in the kitchen, holding the knife. The air smelled of rust and bleach and the faint sweetness of rot. Light from the window cut thin, watery slashes across the counter. The figure, she, sat on the floor, wrapped in the quilt like a misplaced piece of furniture. He could kill her now. He knew that. It would be easy, a single, swift movement. He had done it before, countless times, without thinking. Muscle memory would guide him if he simply let it, but something rooted him to the floor. The knife hovered in his hand, useless. She looked up at him, and even through the half-fogged plastic still clinging to her skin, her eyes were clear. Two dark, shining beads, wet with something that wasn't only fear. Marco set the knife down. He told himself he was tired, that it would be easier to do it later, after some food, after some rest. The lies he whispered to himself were thin as tissue paper, and he pretended not to notice. The days slipped past without names. He did not cut her up for processing. He did not call the plant for disposal. He did not tell anyone she existed. Instead, he fed her. At first, it was scraps, crusts of bread, slivers of meat too small for a full meal, the watery ends of soup left cooling on the stove. He placed them in an old, chipped dog bowl he found under the sink, setting it near her where she could reach if she chose. She ate without speaking, without looking at him. The plastic had peeled away from parts of her skin, revealing raw patches, bruises blooming like strange flowers along her arms and legs. He should have felt disgust. Instead, he felt embarrassed. On the third day, he traded the bowl for a plate. He placed it carefully on the floor, alongside a battered fork. A tiny, absurd courtesy in a world where such things no longer mattered. At night, he listened to her breathing. It was different from before, less ragged, more rhythmic. Sometimes he could almost imagine it syncing with his own, a quiet duet of survival. The dreams returned too. Plastic sheets wrapped tight around his limbs, voices whispering from inside the walls, unseen hands pressing against the skin of his back. And always, always, that word, unspoken but understood. Please. He didn't intend to name her. It was forbidden, after all. Policy dictated strict emotional boundaries, no personalization, no attachment. Product, not person. It was drilled into them from the first day of training. But as he knelt one evening to place a plate of rice and boiled carrots before her, the word slipped out, soft as breath. Sylvia. The name seemed to hang in the air, fragile and absurd. He flinched, expecting something to shatter, but nothing happened. She lifted her head, slowly, the quilt slipping from one bony shoulder. Her mouth moved, a slight tremor at the corners of her lips. Marcos held his breath. Had she said it too? Had she echoed it? Or was it just the desperate twitching of an animal taught to mimic its captor? He didn't know. He didn't want to know. One night, as rain sheeted against the windows and the old pipes sang in the walls, Marcos found himself standing in the kitchen long after midnight, staring into the darkness outside. The window was a dull, warped mirror, reflecting the flickering overhead light and his own haggard face. Behind him, in the reflection, Sylvia sat motionless at the edge of the table, her knees drawn to her chest, wrapped again in the quilt-like armor. He watched her reflection out of the corner of his eye, pretending not to. Her head lolled slightly to one side, like a broken marionette. And then her mouth moved. No sound, just the slow, deliberate shaping of words he could not hear. Marcos turned sharply, heart pounding. In the room itself, Sylvia hadn't moved. She sat there, breathing quietly, blank-eyed, the same as she had all evening. He looked back to the window. The reflection showed her smiling. A small, terrible smile, one that did not exist on her real face. Sleep abandoned him after that. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw that reflection, the mouth moving in silence, the hollow smile blooming like a bruise. He drank coffee until his hands shook. He scrubbed the floors until his knees ached. He listened to old radio stations, static hissing like whispers between half-caught songs. He did anything but sit still, because when he was still, he heard it. Not breathing now, not sobbing. Words, faint, just at the edge of understanding, coming from the far corner where Sylvia curled under her quilt, coming from the cracks in the floorboards, coming from the drain in the sink, coming from the very walls, thin and insistent, a chorus of pleading voices chanting the same word over and over. Remember. By the end of the week, Marcos barely recognized himself. The man in the mirror was hollowed out, skin sagging over sharp bones, eyes ringed with purple and black. He sat at the kitchen table, staring at his hands. They looked old, foreign, trembling. Sylvia, if she was still Sylvia, if she had ever truly been Sylvia, sat opposite him. She watched him with those wide, dark eyes, unblinking. Slowly, carefully, she reached one hand out, fingers trembling, and touched the fork he had left on the table. Gripped it, lifted it, held it, loosely, clumsily, like a child learning how to use utensils for the first time. Marcos felt something seize in his chest, a mix of terror and awe. Sylvia tilted her head, studying the fork, studying him, and then, without warning, she drove the fork into the tabletop, the metal tines digging deep with a sharp, splintering crack. She smiled, not the smile of the reflection, not the sad, hollow imitation he feared. A different smile, smaller, sharper, a smile that said, "I know, I remember, I am not what you think I am." Marcos pushed his chair back so suddenly it screeched against the floor, toppling him onto the linoleum. Sylvia remained seated, hand still gripping the embedded fork, watching him with calm, patient eyes, as if she had all the time in the world. And perhaps she did. Chapter 5. The Lineage of Flesh. The house Marcos grew up in was smaller than he remembered, or maybe it had just shrunk under the weight of time and dust and the things that went unsaid between walls. The wooden steps groaned under his feet as he climbed the porch. The peeling paint flaked like dead skin, catching under his nails as he knocked, once, twice, out of habit. The door swung open before he could knock again. His father stood in the doorway, the hunched silhouette of a man carved down to the bare essentials. Gristle, sinew, resentment. His eyes were sunk deep into his skull, red-rimmed and watery. "You," the old man croaked. "No surprise, no welcome, just identification, like naming an object left out in the rain too long." Marcos nodded once, stepping inside. The air inside the house was thick with the smell of boiled cabbage, mildew, and something older, a sour undertone that turned the stomach if you breathed too deeply. The living room was dim, the curtains drawn tight. Dust motes spun in the shafts of weak sunlight that managed to slip through the cracks. Every wall was lined with framed photographs, just as Marcos remembered. Only now, each photo had been altered. Black tape, neat surgical strips of it, placed over every face, smiling mothers, proud fathers, laughing children, all obliterated, anonymized, made into strange, faceless bodies frozen in mid-embrace. Marcos stared. "Why did you—" His father waved a gnarled hand dismissively, shuffling toward the kitchen. "Better this way," he muttered. "Better not to remember." Marcos hesitated before following. His fingers twitched at his sides, itching to peel back the tape, to see what lay beneath. But he didn't. Not yet. In the kitchen, the old man sat at the wobbly table, a chipped mug of something black and steaming in front of him. He gestured vaguely at the second chair. Marcos sat, the wood creaking under his weight. For a while, neither of them spoke. The clock on the wall ticked loudly, its hand jerking forward every second with a tiny metallic click. Finally, his father cleared his throat, a wet, rattling sound. "You working still?" he asked. Marcos nodded. "Inspection." "Good." A long pause. "Better than the old ways." Marcos leaned forward slightly. "You were a butcher. Before—" His father's mouth twisted into something between a smile and a grimace. "We all were. One way or another." He sipped from his mug. "Different names, same work." Outside, a car rolled past, its tires hissing against the wet asphalt. Marcos chose his words carefully. "You did what you had to do. To survive." His father's hand jerked, sloshing liquid over the rim of the mug. "No," he said sharply, then softer. "We did more than that." He didn't elaborate, didn't need to. The silence between them was heavy, sagging under the accumulated weight of generations. After a while, Marcos excused himself, saying he needed the bathroom. He didn't go there. Instead, he drifted back toward the living room, drawn by the wall of photos. He stood in front of them, heart thudding too hard against his ribs. The tape was cleanly placed, but the adhesive had begun to dry out. In places, the corners lifted, slightly, begging to be pulled. He reached for one. A family portrait, a summer day, judging by the faded blue of the sky. 3 figures stood side by side, a man, a woman, and a child cradled between them. All 3 faces obscured by neat black rectangles. Marcos peeled back the corner, heart hammering. Underneath, a woman's face emerged, smiling, sun-kissed, strands of hair plastered to her forehead with sweat. Her eyes were wide and bright, filled with life. Something about her tugged at him, a distant thread pulling at the back of his mind. He moved on, more urgently now, fingers slipping under the tape of another photograph. This time, a crowd shot. Dozens of people gathered in front of a building he didn't recognize. Families, couples, children. He peeled back strip after strip. Faces emerged, familiar and not. Laughing, shouting, frozen forever in the act of being alive. And then, he saw her, buried in the back of the group, almost obscured by others. A girl, maybe 16, maybe younger, hair tangled, eyes wide with something that wasn't joy, something closer to terror. Sylvia. It was her. Not just a resemblance, not just a trick of memory. It was her, exactly as she appeared now, decades later. Marcos staggered back, the photo fluttering to the floor like a wounded bird. Impossible. His pulse roared in his ears. His skin felt too tight for his body. He turned, half expecting to see his father standing in the doorway, accusing, confirming. But the hallway was empty. Only the house breathing around him, the low groans of wood settling, the hum of unseen pipes. He crouched, hands trembling, and retrieved the photo. He brought it closer to his face, searching for some mistake, some rational explanation. There was none. It was her. The same haunted eyes, the same crooked line to the mouth, the same scar barely visible, curving along the jawline. But the date printed in tiny font at the bottom of the photo told a different story. Before he was born, before she should have existed. The photo slipped from his fingers again, landing face up on the carpet. From somewhere deeper in the house, a noise echoed, a low, dragging scrape, like something heavy being pulled across the floor. Marcos turned toward the sound, every nerve in his body screaming in warning. Sylvia. He didn't know if it was her voice, or just the memory of her voice from his dreams. But it called to him, undeniable, familiar. Another scrape. Closer this. Time. He backed away, foot catching on the edge of the rug, heart hammering so hard it felt like it might tear loose from his chest. The living room lights flickered once, twice, and then went out. In the sudden dark, he heard her breathing, shallow, wet, hungry, coming closer. Chapter 6. Crossing Over. The dream started as echoes, faint and directionless. At first, Marcos thought they were simply memories bleeding into sleep. The grating whine of the plant machinery, the slap of bare feet on concrete, the wet organic sounds of product being prepared. But they deepened, shifted, became places he could feel, the cold press of iron bars against his back, the reek of sweat and fear soaking into his clothes. In the dreams, he was no longer the inspector. He was the inspected, bound hand and foot, crammed shoulder to shoulder with others whose faces blurred at the edges of his vision, their eyes hollowed out by waiting. The pens were endless, stretching beyond sight, lit by flickering, bulbs that buzzed overhead like locusts. Somewhere in the distance, a sharp, metallic clang echoed, the sound of gates opening. He would jerk awake, heart hammering, the taste of iron thick in his mouth. Sylvia would be there, curled at the foot of the bed or hunched in the far corner, wrapped in the tattered quilt like a second skin, watching, always watching. It became difficult to tell how many days had passed since he had brought her home. 2, 5, a month. The world, outside the windows, became unreliable. The light filtering through blinds too pale, too gray, the sounds of distant cars and barking dogs fading into an indistinct hum. Marcos found himself checking the calendar, then forgetting why he had bothered. The hours bled together, a slow, sticky slide from morning into evening and back again without clear delineation. The routines that had once grounded him, shower, coffee, inspection, lost their meaning. He stayed home more often, offering vague excuses to the plant when they called. He told himself it was to keep an eye on Sylvia, to make sure she didn't, what? Escape? Attack? Speak? The truth lurked deeper, something he wasn't ready to name. He was afraid to leave her alone, afraid of what she might do, afraid of what he might return to find. He began hearing her voice at odd times, software, barely a whisper, threading through the thin walls of the apartment, woven into the whir of the refrigerator, the hiss of the radiator, not full sentences, just fragments, shapes of words. Help, ... Please, remember. Sometimes he would find her standing by the kitchen window, staring into the night. Her mouth would move, slow and deliberate, but no sound would come. Marcos learned not to interrupt. The one time he did, snapping her name, the false one he had given her, the one that still tasted strange in his mouth, she turned toward him so sharply that he staggered back a step. Her eyes had been empty, then. Not angry, not afraid, just hollow, as if whatever had once inhabited her was now watching from somewhere else, somewhere he couldn't follow. On a morning that felt no different from any other, colorless and heavy with the promise of rain, Marcos woke to silence. No breathing, no shuffling sounds from the other room, no soft murmur of plastic shifting against cloth. For a fleeting moment he thought it might be over, that she had left, that he was alone again. Relief and terror rose in tandem, choking him. He sat up, the mattress creaking under his weight, and swung his legs over the side of the bed. The door to his bedroom stood closed, the pale wood seeming to absorb the faint gray light filtering through the blinds. He rose, padding across the worn carpet in bare feet. When he reached for the doorknob, his hand froze. The metal was cool against his palm, but something was wrong. Very wrong. Above the knob and below it were 2 heavy steel slide bolts, bolted from the outside. Marcos stared, uncomprehending. The bolts were not new, their edges dulled by time and rust, but he had never installed them. Had he? The memory evaded him, slippery as fish in dark water. He tugged at the knob harder, rattling the door against its frame. It didn't budge. He was locked in his own room. Locked in by whom? He pressed his forehead against the door, breathing shallowly. From beyond the door, he heard it, a soft, rhythmic sound. Not footsteps, exactly. More like pacing, slow, deliberate, something dragging slightly with each step. Marcos backed away from the door instinctively. His legs bumped the bed behind him. He wanted to call out, to demand explanation, but fear cinched his throat shut. If she had locked him in, if she had done this, then he was no longer the captor. He was the captive. The pacing stopped. In the suffocating silence that followed, he heard another sound, faint but distinct, the scrape of something sliding against the floorboards, and then a soft, low hum. Music. A tune he didn't recognize, or maybe a lullaby from some other life, half-remembered and mangled by time. The singing grew louder, closer to the door, and then a whisper directly on the other side. "Come and see." A child's voice, light, musical, horribly wrong. Marco stumbled back until his legs hit the dresser, sending a lamp toppling to the floor with a crash. The voice laughed softly. The bolts scraped. The first one slid free. Slow. Inevitable. The second one followed, shrieking slightly against the warped wood. The door creaked inward an inch, revealing a thin sliver of darkness beyond. Marcos stared, frozen, as something small and pale slipped through the gap. Not Sylvia. Not entirely. Something shaped like her. Something waiting. Chapter 7. The Flesh Market. The entrance wasn't marked. Marcos found it by following a chain of murmured directions, passed from worker to worker in cigarette breaks, and supply closets, always ending with a shrug or a warning. It looked like nothing, a rusted service door wedged between an abandoned laundromat and a pawn shop that had been closed for years, its windows blank with sun-faded "for lease" signs. The air smelled of sour metal and mildew, sharp enough to sting the nose. Marcos hesitated for a heartbeat, hand poised above the door's battered handle. His reflection in the cracked window was pale, eyes sunken, mouth a thin, uncertain line. Sylvia's face floated behind his eyes, the real one, the reflected one, the one half smiling in the kitchen window. They overlapped now, impossible to separate. He pushed the door open. The staircase plunged downward at a steep angle, the air growing colder with each step, the walls narrowing as if to squeeze him out. He could hear it before he saw it. A low murmur, a wet, rustling noise, punctuated now and then by short, stifled cries. At the bottom, the floor opened into a cavernous space lit by dangling bulbs swinging on frayed cords. The flesh market. Rows of cages stretched into the dark, stacked 2 and 3 high. The bars were thin and blackened with rust, slick where hands had grasped and pulled and bled. Each cage held a figure, some crouched, shivering, some pressed against the bars with desperate, searching fingers. Others sat perfectly still, gazing out with empty, glassy eyes. They were not labeled with names, only numbers. Some inked onto skin, some tattooed inside mouths or behind ears. And yet, as Marcos moved through the rows, he saw them. Faces he knew, or thought he knew. A woman with his mother's mouth, a boy with the exact tilt of his brother's head, a man whose laugh, hoarse and broken, sounded so much like a friend he'd buried years ago that Marcos staggered sideways, gripping the cold bars for balance. Impossible, but no more impossible than Sylvia. The lines blurred here. Identity was a cheap trick, a mask worn by flesh, until it could be sold, used, discarded. A figure pressed against the bars near him, a girl no older than 10, her eyes swollen, raw lips mouthing something he couldn't hear. He flinched away, heart pounding. This was a mistake. He should leave. He should seal the door behind him and forget he ever knew this place existed. But his feet carried him deeper, drawn by something heavier than curiosity, drawn by the knowledge that Sylvia's origin, and maybe his own unraveling, began somewhere here. Toward the back of the market, tucked into a narrow corridor barely wide enough to walk, he found it. A mirror. Unlike the grime-streaked glass elsewhere, this one was pristine, polished to a near-blinding shine, set into the wall like a window into another world. No cages here, no handlers, just his own reflection staring back at him. For a moment, he didn't recognize himself. His face was hollowed, stretched thin over sharp bones. His clothes hung from his frame like they belonged to someone else. His arms, crossed loosely over his chest, were bruised and banded with faint, red impressions, like bindings. As he watched, a thin white tag appeared around his neck, fluttering slightly despite the stagnant air. He squinted, heart crawling up his throat. On the tag, printed in blocky, smudged letters, Lot number 492-B. The numbers wavered, bleeding into each other, but stayed legible enough to crush any hope of mistake. He stumbled back, away from the mirror, away from the old reflection that did not stumble with him, but instead pressed forward, hands flat against the glass. The reflected Marcos smiled. Not a human smile. Something stretched too far, teeth too bright, eyes too empty. Behind the reflection, the corridor shifted. Where there had been empty space, there were now cages, endless rows, receding into darkness. Each cage held another version of him, some younger, some older, some broken beyond recognition. Each version wore the same tag, Lot number 492-B. The reflection pressed its forehead to the glass, mouthing words Marcos couldn't hear. Then, a faint sound, footsteps, real this time, behind him. He turned. A man approached, if it could still be called a man, tall and thin, draped in a long gray coat that brushed the floor. His face was wrong, the features stretched and slack as though molded from soft clay. His eyes glistened like wet stones. In his gloved hands he carried a clipboard. "You're early," the man said, voice low and gurgling, like a drain choking on water. "I," Marcos croaked, finding his voice strange in his throat. "I'm not." "Inspection," the man said, nodding as if confirming a detail on his clipboard. "Final quality check before auction." He reached out, brushing something against Marcos's wrist. A cold shock pulsed through him. He looked down. A plastic band now circled his wrist, tight and humming slightly. 492-B. "Come along," the man said, turning back into the darkness. "You don't want to be late." They get angry when the product resists. The market around him seemed to pulse, the cages trembling slightly as if breathing. The air grew hotter, thick with the scent of blood and old, damp cloth. Somewhere deep within the market, a bell tolled, low and sonorous, a sound that rattled teeth inside skulls. The auction had begun. Marcos staggered after the man, unable to stop himself, his legs moving as if guided by strings. As he passed the mirror again, his reflection winked at him, and the cage doors began to open. Chapter 8. The Conditioned Mind. The cleaver weighed heavily in Marco's hand. Its blade, honed to a fine gleam, caught the sterile kitchen light and reflected it back at him in tiny, blinding flashes. He stood over Sylvia, or what remained of her, or what she had always been, motionless except for the small tremors that traveled up his arms, rattling the cleaver like a loose hinge. Sylvia sat on the floor, wrapped in the tattered quilt, her knees drawn up, arms encircling them, like a child waiting for punishment. The kitchen smelled of metal, sweat, and something beneath that, the warm, raw smell of life too close to ending. Marcos shifted his weight from one foot to the other, his shoes squeaking faintly against the linoleum. The sound grated in the silence, too loud, too real. He could do it. He had done it before. Muscle memory would guide the swing, the pressure, the clean surgical precision needed to separate flesh from bone. He had been trained, conditioned. Consumers, not victims. Product, not people. The slogans replayed themselves in the background of his mind, like a static radio broadcast he couldn't quite turn off. And yet, he hesitated. Each second stretched, bloated with tension. He thought of the plant, the bright, buzzing lights, the rows of bodies made anonymous by process and policy. He thought of the cages beneath the flesh market, the mirrored reflection with his own hollowed face, stamped for sale. He thought of his father's photographs, faces erased as though memory itself could rot away. His grip tightened on the cleaver, his knuckles bleached bone white. If he did this, he would erase Sylvia too. Her name, her breath, the curve of her mouth forming silent words in the dark. Everything that made her something, someone, would be wiped clean in a single arc of steel. It should be easy. Instead, it felt like standing on the edge of a great, black pit, staring down into something that stared back. Sylvia didn't move. She didn't beg. She only watched him with those dark, fathomless eyes, waiting, expecting, forgiving. And then, when the silence could stretch no thinner without snapping, she spoke. One word, barely audible, but undeniable. Please. The cleaver slipped from Marcos's hand, clattering against the floor with a sound like a gunshot. He staggered back, heart pounding in his ears, hands trembling uncontrollably. She had spoken. Not the garbled mimicry of conditioning, not the mindless parroting. They told themselves the product sometimes displayed. Not noise, not training, not error. Language. Language meant thought. Thought meant mind. Mind meant person. A thing could not plead. Only a person could. Marcos pressed the back of his hand to his mouth, swallowing down the bile rising in his throat. He stumbled into the counter behind him, knocking over a chipped mug that shattered across the tile. Sylvia flinched at the sound, a flinch too human, too real. He could no longer pretend. She was not a product. She had never been. And what was he then? What did that make him? The room tilted slightly, a nauseating lurch, as if the foundations of the apartment, of his very mind, were buckling. He gripped the edge of the counter to steady himself, fingers digging into the soft, swollen wood. The slogans roared in his head again, desperate, panicked. Compliance breeds contentment. Language is contamination. Protect yourself. Protect the process. Marcos squeezed his eyes shut. He saw the pens. He saw the mirrored selves stacked behind iron bars. He saw Sylvia's eyes, not empty, but aware. When he opened them again, Sylvia was still there, still breathing, still waiting. A thread of blood ran down her arm where the cleaver had grazed her, a thin, trembling line that seemed to pulse with life. Marcos slid down the counter to the floor, sitting opposite her. The cleaver lay between them, gleaming under the weak kitchen light like a marker of some invisible boundary neither dared cross. Sylvia tilted her head, studying him. Her face was pale, bruised, framed by tangled hair, but the set of her jaw was steady. She spoke again, softer this time. Please. A request, not a demand. A question, not an answer. For the first time, Marcos realized that maybe she wasn't asking for her life. Maybe she was asking for his. The night stretched onward, slow and heavy. They sat in silence, broken only by the occasional creak of the building settling, the distant sigh of traffic outside. Marcos lost track of time, of hunger, of thirst. He watched Sylvia breathe, watched the slow, deliberate rise and fall of her chest. Not product, not flesh, person. The realization burned through him like acid, eating away at the last tatters of the narrative he had clung to all his life. He saw it now, plain and monstrous. The system didn't just strip them of their humanity. It taught everyone else how to stop seeing it. It taught them how to kill by teaching them how to forget. He wondered distantly how many times he had smiled while signing inspection forms, how many names had been reduced to barcodes under his watchful, complicit eye. Marcos pressed his forehead to his knees, the tile cold against his bare arms. He wept, quietly, uselessly. Sylvia did not move to comfort him. She sat quietly, patient, as if understanding that some grief had to burn itself out alone. When he lifted his head again, the kitchen was darker. The single overhead bulb flickered, casting long, uncertain shadows. And there, across the room, where the light barely reached, a shape stood. Not Sylvia, not entirely human. It was tall, thin, wrapped in layers of translucent plastic that fluttered with every slight movement. Its face was obscured, but its hands, long skeletal things, flexed slowly, rhythmically, like a butcher warming up. It watched them, waiting. The cleaver glinted in the dim light. Sylvia's eyes locked onto Marcos, wide and full of terrible understanding. She opened her mouth not to speak, but to scream. Chapter 9. Harvest season. The knock on the door was neither loud nor impatient. It was a professional knock, 2 sharp raps, a pause, a third, calibrated to convey both authority and inevitability. Marcos froze where he stood in the middle of the kitchen, heart thudding painfully against his ribs. The cleaver still lay where it had fallen hours before, its blade smeared with the ghost of a wound he hadn't dared complete. The second knock came, louder this time. No choice, no escape. He could already picture them, the inspectors, the compliance officers in their gray, expressionless uniforms, clipboards and scanners in hand, their faces blurred by the anonymity of function. Behind them, the silent vans, the gurneys, the easy, practiced violence of enforcement. Marcos's hand went instinctively to the doorknob, but he didn't turn it. Instead, he turned back to the room, to Sylvia. She stood atop the kitchen table, barefoot, the tattered quilt pooling around her feet like a discarded offering. Her arms were stretched wide, palms open, face lifted toward the ceiling. Not pleading, not surrendering, defying. Her hair, tangled and dark, clung to her temples. Her ribs jutted sharply under paper-thin skin. And her eyes burned with something ancient and furious, something that refused to be catalogued or processed or erased. For a moment, Marcos couldn't breathe, couldn't think. All he could do was see her, fully, terribly, for the first time. The third knock boomed against the door. This time a voice followed, flat and official. Inspection. Open immediately. Marcos moved without realizing, grabbing the cleaver from the floor, tucking it behind his back like a guilty thought. Sylvia didn't flinch. She didn't move at all. Only her eyes followed him, wide and unblinking, drinking in every faltering step he took. He opened the door. 3 of them, 2 men and a woman, all in matching gray uniforms stitched with the black sigil of the authority, an open eye above a harvest scythe. Their faces were disturbingly similar, bland, symmetrical, blank. The lead inspector, a tall man with a clipboard pressed tightly to his chest, nodded curtly. Subject delivery was confirmed for this address, he said, voice devoid of warmth. We are here to conduct final processing or initiate contamination protocol if necessary. Marcos's throat closed. He understood the terms. He knew the consequences. If he could not demonstrate compliant handling, if he could not show the subject processed, packaged, prepared, he would be flagged. Not just fined, not just punished, recycled, reclassified. Another body to feed the endless hunger. Behind the inspectors, the hallway seemed to narrow, pressing in with invisible weight. Marcos stammered. I need a little more time. The lead inspector's expression didn't change, but Marcos could see the flicker of annoyance ripple through his posture. You've exceeded the recommended acclimation window, the woman beside him said, voice clipped. Subject must be terminated immediately. Delay is considered grounds for contamination designation. Contamination. A word spoken lightly, mechanically. A word that erased the self with surgical precision. Marco stepped aside, allowing them into the apartment. The air inside was different, thicker. The inspectors hesitated, noses wrinkling slightly as they registered it. The rich, fetid scent of sweat, fear, and something deeper, decay ripening beneath the surface. The woman pulled a small device from her belt, a scanner, and pointed it at the room, at Sylvia, at him. The screen flashed a warning. Emotional deviation detected. Marcos swallowed hard, his hand, slick with sweat, tightened around the cleaver hidden behind his back. He could see their movements now, how easy it would be. One step forward, one strike. Sylvia, compliant and silent, packaged neatly for inspection. All he had to do was complete the cycle. Be what they had made him to be. He turned back to the kitchen. Sylvia hadn't moved. She stood tall atop the table, arms still spread, trembling slightly from the effort. Her face glowed with a feverish light, mouth slightly open as if drinking the heavy air. Her eyes found his again, and in them Marco saw no fear, no pleading, only certainty. The lead inspector stepped forward, raising a tranquilizer injector from his belt. The device whined softly as it powered up. "Subject non-compliant," he said, "preparing for forced reclamation." Marcos moved without thinking, not toward Sylvia, toward them. The cleaver flashed once in the weak kitchen light, not a strike, not yet, but a warning raised high, trembling with hesitation and fury. The inspectors froze, reading him now as threat instead of liability. The scanner on the woman's belt beeped again. Contaminant classification confirmed. It was over. Even if he complied now, even if he dropped the cleaver, even if he fell to his knees and begged, they would take him. Marcos tightened his grip. The lead inspector raised his injector, the needle gleaming. Sylvia moved. It was not a lunge, not a flight. It was a step, slow, deliberate, down from the table onto the floor. Her feet were bare, bloodless, but her movement cracked the silence open like a thunderclap. She crossed the space between herself and Marcos in 2 steps, and when she reached him, she did not cower behind him. She stood at his side, facing them, facing the ones who demanded her submission. Her hand brushed his, the barest contact, and in that moment something passed between them. A memory, a promise, a truth too large to name. The inspectors raised their weapons in unison, and from somewhere deep within Sylvia's bruised and battered chest, a sound began to rise, not a scream, not a plea, a song, low, guttural, and terrible. The walls shivered, the floor trembled. The air itself seemed to curdle and retreat. The inspectors hesitated, only for a second, but it was enough. Marcos lunged, not with precision, but with the blind, furious desperation of someone who has nothing left to lose. The cleaver met flesh. Somewhere, something toppled, metal, plastic, bone, and then silence. Thicker now, more complete. Marcos blinked, breathing hard, heart roaring in his ears. The lead inspector lay sprawled across the kitchen floor, the injector shattered beside him. The others backed away slowly, hands raised in a gesture of neutrality, retreating toward the door. Sylvia stood beside Marcos, still and silent once more. And when she smiled, not with malice, but with something deeper, darker, triumphant, he knew. The harvest had already begun, and it was no longer theirs to control. Chapter 10. Tender is the flesh. The sirens bled into the night, a low, mournful wail that vibrated the thin glass in the windows. Marcos sat on the kitchen floor, the cleaver still warm in his hand, the blade sticky with something that no longer seemed capable of being categorized as just blood. The inspectors were gone, or maybe they were still there. their bodies crumpled into unnatural shapes on the cracked linoleum, faces twisted in some final unfinished gesture. Marcos didn't look. He couldn't. His gaze was fixed on Sylvia. She lay sprawled a few feet away, the remnants of the quilt tangled around her legs like seaweed around a drowning body. Her face was slack, eyes closed, mouth slightly open. The wound at her side, where one of the injectors had struck, pulsed faintly. Or maybe it didn't. Maybe that was just the memory of her breathing, refusing to leave him even now. The sirens grew louder, closer, their mournful cry cutting into the heavy, sour air of the apartment. They were coming, not to ask questions, not to listen, to erase, to process, to cleanse. Marcos understood that now. The system didn't punish the act. It didn't punish killing. It didn't punish cruelty. It punished feeling. He had contaminated himself the moment he named her, the moment he hesitated, the moment he saw her not as product, but as person. There had never been a way back, only forward, into whatever awaited beyond the threshold of sanctioned violence. The kitchen clock, long since frozen, reflected a single shard of light onto the wall, a pale, flickering rectangle that grew and shrank with each heartbeat. Marcos moved. Slowly, deliberately, he set the cleaver down beside him. The sound it made was small, insignificant, like a stone dropped into a bottomless well. He crawled across the floor to Sylvia. The quilt was damp, heavy with sweat and blood. He peeled it back carefully, exposing her thin, bruised body, the soft rise and fall of her chest so faint he might have imagined it, or hoped it. His hands, steady now, slipped under her knees and back. She was lighter than he expected, feather light, as if the system had already begun to strip her down to essential elements, flesh, bone, memory. He lifted her, held her against his chest. Her head lolled back, exposing the delicate ridge of her throat, marred by dirt and old scars. The sirens hit their crescendo. Flashing red and white lights broke against the apartment walls in dizzying, violent rhythms, turning everything inside the kitchen into a stuttering sequence of images. The cleaver, the toppled chairs, the splintered table, the open door. They would storm inside soon. They would ask no questions. They would execute the contaminated process as efficiently as any other transaction. Marcos staggered to his feet, still cradling Sylvia. He didn't know where he was going, only that he had to move, only that standing still was death. The floor seemed to tilt beneath him, the corners of the room warping, stretching impossibly toward each other. The stench of blood was overpowering now, a thick, sweet perfume that clung to his skin and hair and clothes. Sylvia's head rested against his collarbone, her breath, if it still existed, damp and fleeting against his neck. Outside, the engines of the authority vans idled with mechanical patience. Boots thudded against concrete. Commands were barked in clipped syllables. The walls trembled under the onslaught of reality. Marcos staggered toward the door. His legs, rubbery and untrustworthy, threatened to buckle under the combined weight of his guilt, his horror, and the terrible, fragile thing in his arms. He paused at the threshold. Behind him, the apartment exhaled one final fetid breath. The walls seemed to sag, exhausted. The broken furniture slumped inward, folding into itself. The air shimmered with heat and grief. It would all be scrubbed clean soon, painted over, repackaged, forgotten. Another contamination neutralized, another anomaly buried under layers of sanctioned forgetting. Marcos tightened his grip on Sylvia. Her eyes fluttered open, just for a moment, and in them he saw not fear, not pain, but recognition. A terrible, luminous understanding that passed between them like a spark catching dry grass. He stepped out into the corridor. The hallway was flooded with flashing lights and the smell of burning ozone. Silhouettes moved toward him, gray shapes with gleaming weapons, faces obscured by masks that filtered out not disease, but conscience. He heard a voice bark an order. Another shouted for him to surrender. But Marcos kept moving, slowly, deliberately, the way Sylvia had taught him, the way only the contaminated learn. The figures raised their weapons. The world contracted into a single, frozen moment. Sylvia's hand twitched against his chest. The first shot rang out. The impact spun him sideways, the world tilting wildly, the lights blurring into streaks of red and white and black. He hit the floor hard, his body curling protectively around Sylvia's. She made no sound. Neither did he. The figures surrounded him, their boots thudding dully against the ground, their weapons trained on the broken pile he had become. Through the growing darkness at the edge of his vision, Marco saw one of them approach. The inspector knelt, clipboard still clutched tight against his chest. He bent low, inspecting Sylvia's limp form with the clinical detachment of a man assessing produce. The inspector nodded once, scribbled something on his clipboard, and spoke into a small black device clipped to his shoulder. Subject still viable for repurposing. Contaminant. Neutralized. He stood, signaling the others. Marcos tried to lift his head, tried to speak, tried to tell them that it wasn't him who had contaminated her, that she had never needed saving, that maybe he had, but no sound came, only the final exhale of a body outlasting its usefulness. As the inspectors moved in with gurneys and restraints, as the sirens finally began to fade into the night, Marcos's hand slid over Sylvia's. Dead or alive, flesh or soul, he could no longer tell, but he held on. Anyway, because in the end, it was never tenderness the system feared. It was the memory of it.